The other thing is we're going to be taking notes on Etherpad, as we always do. Yes? No Etherpad? Okay. All right. So here is Meet Echo, so I think we can switch over.
All right, call this meeting of Parliament to order. We're going to be talking about Yangtze today, therefore I must be Theresa May. In all seriousness, this is the update from our Yang versioning design team. Initially, the plan was to go to the next slide. Initially, the plan was to have me talk for 5 minutes on requirements, which after 103, we thought with some rewording that I'll go over, we thought that they were sufficient. Some recent discussion has come up on the mailing list, and therefore we want to drill down a little bit here. So if there is time after my session, Rob and Balash and Rashad will come up and talk about what's up there. Maybe that's why.
Just say next.
Okay. So this is the requirements redux. So next slide, please. Maybe. Okay.
Just say next.
I did.
Oh.
Changes since revision 1. We modified requirement the text around requirement 1.4 to pull out the word software release. There was some contention last meeting that software release implied 2 vendor-specific things, and there was worry that we would just layer on more and more versions based on a vendor release cycle. We also changed the requirement 3.2, so it didn't suggest a solution, but merely talked about what we needed to do in terms of a requirement. We pulled out requirement 4.4 and we added an acknowledgement for inspiration from the open config group. Let's take a deeper look into that. So next slide, please. So this is the old text of requirement 1.4. Again, we pulled out that talk about software releases and release, sort of vendor release text, and we made it a little bit more generic. The solution must allow for backwards compatible enhancements and bug fixes, as well as non-backwards compatible bug fixes in non-latest release modules. We'll get into branching in a minute when I ask the various questions, but this was sort of trying to address the need for some level of branching where we do want to make changes to the non-current or non-head version of a module. Next slide, please, Lou. So this is the modified requirement 3.2. Again, we did not want to suggest a solution. This is just the requirements draft. So the new text, the solution must provide a mechanism to support clients that expect an older version of a given module when the current version has had non-backwards compatible changes. That's the new 3.2. Next slide, please. 4.4 went away. You can see what the old text was. There is no new text. Next slide. So the draft has been adopted. We got an email over the weekend, I believe from Lou or Kent. The draft has been adopted, but there were questions raised during the adoption call, and we want to address them. Ultimately, what we want to do is make some decisions. This is not the final state of this document. It has been adopted, but it can still now be ratified and worked on by the working group. So next slide, please. Rod presented this slide in 103, the last meeting, relative to the solution. What I want to say here is we've heard a lot of feedback from both ends of this spectrum. The requirements are supposed to kind of meet in the middle, what the design team has thought is the best possible compromise to solve things that we already perceive are problems or that are already happening. and that we want to make sure that it's not the wild, wild west. Vendors, I'm from one, have a tendency to go crazy sometimes. If we can ratify some requirements here, as well as some guiding principles, we can hopefully curtail any and everything is allowed, or vendors are just going to do their own thing isms. So we're trying to meet in the middle, come up with a set of requirements that people can agree or at least live with. Next slide, please. So the open questions, the questions that were raised, and we really need to come to some level of consensus or agreement, if you will, on this. Number one, who feels RFC 7950, Section 11, I see Martin moving, is sufficient and does not require changes? I'm going to back away and Martin.
So, Martin Björklund, I think that you still define backwards compatible changes as changes that follow this section, right?
Correct. With respect, there was some differentiation in how we handle deprecated and obsolete,
Right.
but in general,
But
yes.
Apart from that, so the question is, do we want to define backwards compatible changes in a different way? Do we have problems with the current definition? Is that the question?
What we are, the question here is more around, is this too rigid? Do we need to, we think, at least for deprecated and obsolete, changes are required. Is this not doing us a service in terms of being able to either release the Yang modules we need to at a timely manner, or are we enforcing things that just aren't being followed, and thus there are different solutions coming out of the module author space?
So isn't the question really, should we allow non-backwards compatible changes?
That question is coming.
Okay, so then this is just about the definition of what is a non-backwards compatible change. Okay.
Correct.
Okay.
Láďa Hutka, I think actually this is a wrong question. For me, the right question would be to ask whether Section 11 has to be in the definition of Yang, the language. Of course, I understand that organizations like IETF may have some policies regarding to update rules for modules, but in my view, this section shouldn't be in the definition of Yang, and so we won't have these problems on the level of Yang. Of course, then if some mechanism like somewhere will be accepted in the IETF, that's another question, but it should not be a question for Yang as such.
It's an interesting observation. It's not one that I think has come up in the design team is do we pull this out? When we were talking about the solution space, not that this is, but we were talking about what guiding principles, what would we do? And you're right, I think those, obviously they would be in a different draft, but I think there should be something, myself personally, that stands alongside that kind of reins in some of this to not make it seem maybe so daunting, or at least give some bounds into how this is interpreted. Anyway, next slide, our position on...
Before you go there, a comment, well, an alternate question is just whether the RFC is sufficient versus Section 11. Because I think if you're saying just limiting it to Section 11, you're actually presupposing a particular solution. If you say, can we change the base RFC, that allows a wider scope of solution.
It's funny you said, we actually, that was how the question read initially last night. We wanted to rein it in because we didn't, there are questions around Yang next, and what's going to happen ultimately to the definition of Yang. So we wanted to kind of rein it in a little bit.
We could rein it in by saying in the context of revisioning,
yes.
Or revisions or versioning,
yes.
take your pick. Yeah, that question I'd actually feel a lot more comfortable with in the way that you're phrasing it.
Yeah,
and I have no idea which hat I'm wearing, by the way.
Okay. So this is, if this feels rough, it's because, yes, we met again late-ish last night to kind of put this together. But I think, and hopefully the next slide, which shows our positions here, we talk about some of the things that from the purpose of revisioning or modifying modules, and it's already come up a little in the NetConf working group today. This is our position. To some extent, we didn't have all the bullets, but we feel that it is not sufficient because, for example, obsolete introduces non-backwards compatibilities already. There is no way to, with the import by revision, it's too rigid. There's no way to say, I need to import this revision of a Yang module and later. And you could say, well, because there should not be any non-backwards compatible changes. Well, what if you need a new leaf or a new grouping from a future revision of the module? How do you know that you're starting at that point and later? So there's a limitation there. We're capitulating that vendors are already making non-backwards compatible changes, and there's no signaling to the user, to their consumers, that these changes are in there. So the onus becomes again on the client to be able to figure and distinguish what has changed with respect to their use cases. And today, an implementer could, if they wanted, say, you know what, you're not going to let me make these non-backwards compatible changes, so I'll create a new module with a new name, and I just won't support the old one in the next client. And then there's still going to be shuffling, there's still going to be pain put onto the end user in order to adapt to that. So we feel that that ultimately what we're saying is there is a problem to be solved here. What that solution is, what the solution to the problem is up for some debate, but there is a problem to be solved. Next slide, please, Lou, unless you had any. I could have sworn I fixed that to say 2. This is question 2. Are non-backwards compatible changes required? I think that was the question Martin was getting to. So are non-backwards compatible changes required to an existing module? Let's see, Jürgen.
Jürgen Schönwelder. The question is underspecified. So you have to say what you probably are saying or hinting in your head to the same module path, right?
Correct. So I'll ask again, are non-backwards compatible changes required to a existing Yang path node, to an existing node defined in a Yang in a given Yang module?
Martin Björklund. You probably mean allowed? I mean, obviously they are not required. We can't require that every change must be non-backwards compatible. So you probably meant allowed. Sure. So I actually liked Andy's perhaps compromise solution on the mailing list, where we phrase this as acknowledge that people sort of like deviations. We acknowledge that people do these things, so we should have a way to indicate that.
I wouldn't say allowed. Allowed maybe, but should they be supported? Yes. I scanned through the email this morning. I saw Andy's email, and ultimately one of our goals has been in the design team is to make it, to signal to the consumer, the end user, that non-backwards compatible changes exist. So I would tend to agree with what Andy was saying there.
Right, and that is something that I can support as well. You know, if you phrase it that way, then I think it makes sense, because everyone knows that these things happen, right? Mm-hmm. And it is goodness that whatever happens is advertised or documented. So I can live with that.
Okay.
Asian of Cisco Systems. I have been involved in all the discussions, so I apologize if I missed something, but what would really be useful would be how these were handled from a workflow standpoint, both of this from the client and the server. Like, how do you deprecate one node and support it, and then move to something different? Just like, what's day 0, day 2, day 3 in the different phases. That would be invaluable, and to get everybody to agree on it.
So about that, some of the proposed solution that will, maybe if we have time, be presented next, goes into some of that. In fact, we have sections in there about, I believe Rashad was one of the major contributors there. What should a module author do as part of the transition if they need to introduce these non-backwards compatible changes? So time allowed, we will get to discussing some of that. From a requirements standpoint, I like, Martin, the kind of the question revision. And yes, we realize these things. In fact, next slide, please, Lou. I think we have some positional elements here. They are not necessarily desired, but sometimes you have to do them. You have to make them because they make the most logical sense. For example, fixing a bug in a node makes more sense to change it than to deprecate and then obsolete and then create a new node. How do we signal that to the user? To Andy and then Martin's point at the microphone, how do we signal that so that there is an expectation that this could have a breaking or an impact on tooling, so it becomes, the transitional period is less painful to that user? From a requirements standpoint, ultimately, we feel that yes, non-backwards compatible changes should be allowed, should be supported, and there needs to be that mechanism to signal that. Next slide, please, Lou.
Yeah, I'm struggling with a comment that I still feel like the phrasing here is presupposing a solution. In that, I think we can all agree that we need better support for non-backward compatible changes. Whether it requires what we do with the path or the specific node references, the XPaths. I think that could be part of the solution discussion, and we don't have to include that in the phrasing of the requirements. It's not on the slide. It was in what you said earlier, and it goes also a little bit to, I think, some of the point that Martin was raising about, is the term required allowed? I think we all agree that we need to do something here. I think it's in the solution space we have some radical disagreements.
Okay, so let me ask it this way then, to your comment. Is there anything in the current text of the requirements draft that you, well, it's been adopted, so I realize that text will change as we shape this. Is there anything immediately in that text that you object to that we could quickly or in the near term change?
I went through it actually last night with exactly that thought, and didn't have a good answer. There was some minor things like what Rob brought up about comments about, is it really bad for the client, or who's it good? But that's not really significant. I do think we should think about if there's a way we can improve it, and really that, I think, will directly address Martin's objection that he had during the adoption poll. Or I hope we can figure out how to fix the language to do that.
Okay.
And that was part of why we talked about whether we should adopt it or not, and we eventually decided yes, because we can change it.
Okay.
But we think it's really important to do that. So we have to. It's a struggle, but we have to figure out how to get the language right there.
Agreed. Okay.
And to Andy's point about how important it is that we have a requirements document. Personally, this is not a personal statement, not a chair statement. I don't really care if it's published as an RFC. I think it's very important that we have a working group document that establishes consensus on, or defines the consensus of what it is we're trying to solve. So I think that's really important to help us get to a solution. Whether the requirements that comes in RFC, who cares?
And in fact, I think initially that's what we said. I think initially we said we would probably not take this all the way to ratification, right. But it does help solidify on paper, this is the problem to be solved.
So Martin Björklund again, if that is what is going to happen with this document, that it's not going to be published as an RFC, then I think that should be stated, because otherwise we'll do reviews as if it was going to be an RFC, right? We don't have to spend time reviewing language stuff, for example, or things like that. If it's just for like a temporary document that is not going to be published.
I think from a chair standpoint, we haven't established that. We're going to defer to the working group on that. So if the working group wants to publish it as an RFC, that's fine. If we end up with a solution and then say, okay, now it doesn't matter, I think that's fine also.
So yeah, I think it was, as a chair, I posted to the DT mailing list on this very point, and I made exactly Lou's point, that is it important to have a document that establishes working group consensus, and even taking it to last call, whether or not we published it would be sort of the open-ended question, and I personally wasn't concerned, which way it went, but I believe there was some feedback from the DT members saying that, if we put that much work into it, then we should publish it. It doesn't hurt. The publication process itself is cheap. If the publication process is the thing that's in the way, then that's a process issue, and we shouldn't allow that to complicate things. And so I think I actually understood it, at least, that the DT wanted to publish it, to have it as an informational RFC.
We definitely want the working group to agree on this. If this we feel is a problem, a critical problem, and something that we want the working group to agree on.
Rob Wilton, Cisco. So I think that one of the things I was discussing with Martin earlier today was maybe like the background section in this document. I think he was describing that some of that description wasn't necessarily ideal and could be rephrased and worked on. The question is whether that's a useful use of time. If the only thing we care about in this document is actually the list of definitive requirements, then do we want to spend time discussing the background text if it's not going to progress further? Or would it be better to say, actually, the only thing that matters in this document is that list of requirements, and maybe make the document shorter, just to those bullet point statements, and work on getting those agreed in the working group?
I think this is something we can defer until we have, whether we publish or not, I think we can defer until the time we actually have a solution, and then we can decide at that point whether it still makes sense. Do you want to see what the sense of the room is right now of where we are leaning, or does it sort of not matter at this point?
You said that you defer until we have a solution.
Yeah.
But I think the question is, don't we want to know the requirements? Before we have a solution.
I think we have to have the requirements. I'm just saying the decision of whether, I'm not saying the decision of whether they would kill the document or not. I don't think anyone's proposing killing the document right now. The question is once we have it, capture what the requirements are, we have agreement. Down the line, we'll build solutions based on that. Once we have that, do we actually publish as an RFC or not? And I think that's an open question.
Right, but to Rob's point, the question was to what effort, to what extent do we put the effort into, making sure every part of this document is complete? Now, I personally would like to get a sense from the room,
Sure.
If you don't mind. So for those, sorry, microphone.
Christian Hops, can I make a suggestion? I think Martin and Rob are both saying, let's not work on language issues if we're not going to publish it. So why don't we just say, let's not work on language issues until later? Since you guys want to defer to the decision, and then we don't need to just check the room or anything.
Chris, is another way to phrase it is, let's just focus on getting the agreement on the requirements and worry about the rest of the document later. Is that what you're saying? Chris is nodding his head, even though he's not at the mic. That's fine.
Okay, well, I think, right, so that was one of the opinions. So, Chris, you get to not raise your hand. So for those who would like to see this document published as an RFC, can you please, this is the requirements document. For those who would like to see the requirements document published as an RFC, please raise your hand. Just a few. For those who would like to not see it published as an RFC, you do not want to have this published as an RFC, please raise your hand. Equal number, just a few. So we're going to defer. Oh, I'm sorry. How many people we should defer that decision? As almost double the number there. So
Okay.
it's a few.
All right, thanks.
Okay.
All right, last question. Also probably going to be question 1. Next slide, please, Lou. Yep. Is branching required? And if so, how much branching is needed? And for clarity, because again, we wrote these last night, branching means if I need to make a change to the non-latest version of the module. So things are going on, I've made some changes, there's only one instance ever of that module, and then all of a sudden I realize that the latest revision is something and I have to go back and change the other, change an older revision of it, then a branch gets created. How much of that branching should we allow that? And if so, how much branching is needed there?
Christian Hotz again. I've been trying to hold off on this question until the end, but I think somebody else might have mentioned this in the list. I don't think I would have quite as many objections to all of this that's going on if you just said it was for vendor models. Like it wouldn't be used in standardization. Right?
Chris,
because
can you say that if it just, and then
if the branching and all of these different requirements were narrowed in scope to only vendor, in other words, not IETF published modules, because I don't see any need for branching in standards. And as a matter of fact, it would be a horrible outcome to have branches of ISIS module, right? I mean, it's just, this is so much complexity that's absolutely not needed. The process of standardizing a module should get us good enough things, so we just need to augment them. We just don't need this at all. Now, you wanted to be able to track your vendor models on release trains, and you have all these other requirements. I just don't want to see that move into the standardization process, right? So, I think that maybe if there were 2 trains for the requirements, right? One for vendors, non-standardized, and one for standardized, because for standardization, all we need is a way to import by revision. And I think the problem's solved.
So 2 things before Martin, you take the mic. One, just because something is supported doesn't mean one has to use it. Just casually saying that. So we've started, at least in the solution side, trying to write guidelines. Maybe it is that the standards body, or at least the IETF, chooses not to do changes to older revisions. That said, we have heard from one working group chair in routing area that there is a desire to do this. Not necessarily make non-backwards compatible changes to a previous revision of a module, but to branch or create 2 parallel tracks of a single module. I don't know if it's still valid, but this was heard on the design team a few months ago. So maybe there is a need, maybe not here in ops area that we've heard, but in routing area, that was something that came up on one of our calls.
I guess I agree with what Chris said just, and I think it comes down to my point about having section 11 in Yang, the definition of Yang, because in fact I agree that in the IETF we needn't any branching probably, whereas there are communities that apparently need it. Right, but at this point we shouldn't be discussing whether having some branches violates the Yang specification or something like that. We just have to accept that there will be cases where some client won't be able to speak to some server, but I think this is okay. We can have niches that just work, and we already have them. OpenConfig is such a niche, and they can do whatever they want. So I think that it would be better if we have some, or if there are some standards underlying all this, even though there may be some niches having different tooling, for example.
And from a requirement standpoint, I think it makes sense then to say that yes, branching should be supported, and we can talk about where we constrain that, and then separately decide what is, perhaps from a solution standpoint, what are the right recommendations for different bodies, if you will. Rob.
Rob Wilson, Cisco. So going back to Chris's point about branching within like standard models, I still think it's possible that IETF will standardize a YANG module that has bugs in it. And it may be that that's the latest revision and then get fixed, and that's fine, there's no issue, no branches required. But it's also possible that that might happen to a model that's older, that somebody starts using some part that's not been well implemented and finds out there's mistakes in that, and they actually want it to be fixed in that older revision. So at that point, rather than being forced to update to the latest.
So I'm staying away from trying to get too deep in here. Is a branching solution considered changing the module name? Because that's what I would say you do there. If you come up with a new BGP module and it's a major revision, you just change it to BGP module 2, right? I mean, well, why do we need branching? Unless that's branching.
Chris, I'll point out that that is presupposing a solution. And that's right. So the problem here is how to phrase the questions without getting into the solution space.
I think I tried to here, but.
Yeah, I think allowed would help. And,
Okay.
you know, and probably every place you have, this is Martin's point.
Okay,
Every place you have required, say allowed.
okay. And that's really what we're trying, yeah, okay.
So going back to Chris, I still think in that scenario, if it was an old module, let's say it was BGP, for example, and there's some bit that was broken, and you said, actually, I just need that bit to be fixed in that older revision. If you produce a new module just for that fix, you've got to not produce just a new module version for that BGP module, but everything else that augments it also has to have a new revision to be able to hook together.
Chris, will you use the mic, please?
So Chris was asking, can you give a concrete example? In terms of what IETF published now in an old module, no. L2SM, when that was published, had lots of mistakes in, but it wasn't developed, so they just fixed it. They bypassed the rules and published a new revision that was non-backwards compatible. That's okay, because you still do linear development. But if the case that actually some people have implemented parts of that, then it becomes much harder to do, and that's the point where you may actually want branching, even in IETF. I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm not saying it would be used a lot, but there might be point instances even then. But for IETF, it's a pragmatic thing to do. You just want to fix that module in a small way.
But I don't understand. Okay, so I've got a module and it's got a bug, and then I need to fix the bug, so I produce a new module, right? But you're saying I should produce a new branch of it, and I should fix the old branch. You know, why don't I just fix the module and publish the new fix? And if we have import by revision, you could maybe narrow it down and get the old version if you want.
So the case I'm concerned about is if there's already a published revision, there's already an updated revision. So it's not the latest one you want to fix, it's an older revision. So you probably do want to fix both, but it's the older one that actually I care about. That's the one that we might be shipping. That's the one we want to fix it. I can tell you. I want to fix both.
I think we've evolved into maybe what would best be an offline conversation. I think.
So Martin Bucklund, a comment to this discussion anyways, and I think we have the same comment about non-backwards compatible changes. We talk about without changing the identification of the node. That is not changing the module name, node name, or path, anything in that. So branching and non-backwards compatible changes are for existing or without changing the node identification. Because otherwise it's trivial. As you said, you can just create a new module, right? We don't have to discuss anything.
Yes, and that's what,
and to the question, I think that this is important. Just like with non-backwards compatible changes, this is something that vendors face. It is a real problem, so we should have some kind of support for this in the language.
I have a comment from Jabber. This is from Andy. Fix bug in module done with errata and standards. Agree only one release train for standards, multiple release trains only for vendors and maybe other SDOs. So I read that as allow for it, but don't use it in the IETF.
and,
And again, that's Andy's comment, not mine.
okay. We've heard from Martin, and in fact, last night, I think Balash at some point is going to address this, with errata could also be problematic, but it sounds like just from a requirement standpoint, this should be, and I'll try to use the right word here, should be allowed.
So another comment, Martin Björklund again, another comment on this question. I think this needs to be documented in the requirements. I don't think this is branching is not part of the requirements. I think it needs to be.
So that's the, let me see if I can get this right. That is the, I think requirement 1.4. We did not put in the explicit word branching, but we intended to, what we said is a change to a non-latest or non-current or non-head version of a module would maybe imply, maybe that's an area of language we could be more explicit in. Tim?
So Tim Carinokia, just to let you know, I mean, in the BBF, we've been doing modeling for about 15 years now. And we do have this method in place. And we have used this method. It happens probably about every 2 years or so. And it's on simplified backward compatible changes. Things that you change may be a range, you know, like you get a port range wrong or a data type might be wrong that you can do. But we have very restrictive requirements as to what is allowed to be done in that fix, right? And it has to be, the critical piece was that it had to be backwards compatible. So you can only like increase a range, or the types have to be consistent between the two, because we know that those things are in the field. So you can expand, but you can't contract the meaning. And so there were some rules that we put around it. So we're very concerned about it to make sure that things were backward compatible.
Last slide, just to cap on this. So, so we think that we should allow some level of branching, but I think maybe Tim brought up the point of bound things, and he wasn't necessarily talking about branching there, but bound what can be changed in the non-latest version of a module. We had this discussion on the design team a lot. What is a bug fix? Should only bug fixes be allowed in those non-latest revisions of the module? And we couldn't agree on what should be allowed because different authors are going to want to do different things. But in terms of branching, we've heard from both sides, and one side is no branching, everything should be linear, and then the other side is sky's the limit. It can be more like Git as an example, or a revision control system. And we think that there's probably a balance there. But that goes more to the solution side of things, which maybe, no, we won't. But within the design team's proposed solution, we talk about how we would address branching. Regardless, we feel that however we do it with recommendations for IETF versus non-IETF, we feel that branching as a concept should be allowed in the solution, and therefore should be a requirement. And maybe to Martin's point, we need to be a little bit more explicit about branching as a requirement. That is the final set of questions and positions that I was going to present.
All right, Joe, thanks.
Yep.
So question, we feel bad about having run out of time, and of course we did have to address the requirements issue, but still there's a lot of discussion to be had around the other slides that were not presented. The chairs would like to ask if people are planning to be here on Friday, we could potentially uncancel Friday's meeting and allow people to continue having some of the discussions while you're here together. So I'd just like to get a sense from the room, how many people are planning to be here on Friday? Okay, quite a number.
What time was the?
Time?
11 to 1.
11 to 1. Okay, and then how many people would like to us uncancel that meeting and then allow you to use that time to continue this discussion? Please raise your hand.
Just before that, I know I will not be here. I know Rob is also, I believe, having to leave. So who in the design team is planning to be here on Friday?
Thank you.
Balash. Doesn't even look like Rashad is going to be.
I know that there was some confusion with the schedule, and that made this Friday a little unusual. And that, that's actually why we did this kabuki dance with schedules.
Yeah, maybe a scheduling question too. I thought I saw something for Wednesday afternoon, but it wasn't. I was just catching up on email. Is that kind of a design team thing, or I mean, that was? Could you
that's
talk
what-
about that?
That's where we were going to go. There is a right now an informal design team meeting, and question for the design team: are you comfortable publishing that to the list and inviting anyone who wants to come discuss? Have an informal meeting and just take advantage of the time here and see if you can have more discussion on requirements. Of course, that would not be a working group meeting, so you would come back and report what your findings were to the working group, and we can on the list sort of try to hash through resolving the requirements.
I don't think I had anything on
Yes.
Wednesday on my calendar,
No,
Tuesday.
I don't remember
but-
what day it was.
okay.
I just know that there were some
I
meetings planned.
personally do not object. I think we want to have one meeting with the design team, but I personally don't object.
So
if there's
On
time.
Wed- on Wednesday, there's a planned Gang Next get-together meeting, and perhaps that's what Charles saw. It's a different topic, but there's other time within the experiment hours available, and potentially even tomorrow. We're not meeting. Okay, but but going to the point about Friday, if Balazs is the only design team member that is going to be present on Friday, I actually don't think it's going to make sense to try to do a meeting on Friday. So let's just not try to push for that anymore.
So Rob Wilton, so we have a Yang version design team meeting scheduled for Tuesday afternoon, the last slot. I think it's about 4 p.m. to 6:30, and we've got a room booked for that. So, which I think, I might be wrong, holds 60 people. So that might be a good opportunity for people who are interested to have that more open forum. And I think that makes sense to have everyone here because we meet on a regular basis over WebEx anyway.
That's great. Why don't you guys talk offline and send a message to the list
Yeah.
with basically an invite saying
Yeah.
this is when we're getting together, and please then report back to the working group on email, and we can try to resolve this as much as possible on email. Given the time constraints, I think we're going to have to end up with a interim if we don't end up with some easy solution on email.
Yep.
So
Okay.
And by easy solution, you mean easy requirements
easily judged as a consensus opinion of the working group.
of requirements or of the solution?
Oh, of the requirements.
Okay, that's what I thought you meant. Just wanted to be,
Sorry.
you said
Yeah.
solution, so okay.
Resolution. How's that? That's
Copy
better.
that.
That would have been better. I misspoke.
I've been there just 5 minutes ago.
Thank you all for accommodating the tight schedule, and hopefully we can resolve this before the next IETF, whether it be on list or through use of interims. Thank you. So we're meeting again later in this afternoon, session 1
In Congress Hall 1.
in Congress Hall 1. So thank you. And we do actually have to vacate the room because there's another group coming in about 10 minutes.
And if anybody knows where the blue sheets are, hold them up.
We didn't do separate blue sheets.
We did not do it for separate blue sheets. We just wanted to share blue sheets.